this kicked off. It's a webinar type style, so it's a little more restrictive than maybe some of you are used to. So we're gonna just kick this off, and then later in the agenda we'll give you the power of the mic if you want to share something. So for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Sibel Emmett, and I work for Public Works Environmental Services. I'm an environmental program manager, and I'm a member of the county wildfire coordinator team. And Serena is part of that team as well, here to help us. And we are a team that includes county staff as well as RCD, Resource Conservation District staff, that supports the Board of Supervisors appointed Humboldt County Fire Safe Council. And that Fire Safe Council is appointed to provide guidance for the maintenance and implementation of our Community Wildfire Protection Plan, which is the county-wide fire plan to prepare communities and our landscapes for wildfire. And we are in the process of updating our 2019 Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And we are fortunate that we have a good plan in place. And this update is just going to make that plan even better and refresh a few elements of it that kind of brings it into current relevancy a little bit more. But I do want to emphasize that the plan, it has been and is continuing to be used to leverage additional funding to implement projects, as well as to inspire action on the part of different communities throughout the county. So we hired Dudek to help us update that plan and refresh it. And so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jeremy from our Dudek team. So welcome, Jeremy, and your team. Thank you very much for helping us with this.
Thank you, Sibel. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeremy Kahn. I'm the project manager from Dudek. And thank you for participating in this community workshop for the Humboldt County Community Wildfire Protection Plan update. I'm going to give a presentation. Myself and Matthew will give a presentation. I will summarize our CWPP, our Community Wildfire Protection Plan efforts so far. And then I will pass it on to Matthew to go over the spatial risk assessment. Matthew, can you share the presentation?
Yep, no problem. Ready.
Thank you. And can you go ahead one slide, please?
Yep.
Before I go over the Community Wildfire Protection Plan update, I do want to go over the meeting agenda, some housekeeping items, acknowledge where the funding for this update comes from, and to go over the team members, both at Dudek and the county itself. So we'll start the community workshop with this presentation, and then that'll be my portion plus Matthew's. After that, we'll have a question and answer period. And then Allison will take over, and Allison will lead the group discussion questions and map and poster activities, which will be done as the entire group, everyone in the meeting and anyone who does join the meeting later on. And then after that, we'll break out into smaller group discussions. And then finally, we'll conclude the meeting by how to stay involved with the Community Wildfire Protection Plan update. Matthew, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So housekeeping items, we're recording this webinar. The presentation portion, that is my portion that I'm presenting right now, and Matthew's portion will be recorded and put on the county website, available to the public. The latter portions, that is like the group discussion, the group activities, will still be recorded, but they're only going to be used internally for note taking. They will not be put on the county website. During the presentation portion, if you're an attendee, your microphone is going to be muted and you won't be available to talk. But during the question and answer, during the group discussion, and certainly during the activities in the breakout room, you will have the ability to raise your hand, and that's the hand icon at the top of the menu on the screen, and we can unmute microphones for people to ask questions. And the chat feature in this, which is also on the menu bar up above, it's that chat bubble, is available throughout the entire workshop during the presentation as well. So feel free to use that to ask questions and leave comments throughout the workshop. Next slide, please. Funding for this project was partially provided by a grant from the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection and as part of the California Climate Investments Program through the California Fire Safe Council and by CAL FIRE's Wildfire Prevention Grants Program. Next slide, please. So real quickly, I'll just go over the project team itself. I believe Sibel did a pretty good job introducing it, but I did want to just introduce each member. The Community Wildfire Protection Plan team members include it includes the county staff, Humboldt County staff, the county RCD, the Resource Conservation District, and the Humboldt County Fire Safe Council, as Sibel mentioned. And the county is working with Dudek as your consultant to help you with this Community Wildfire Protection Plan update. The next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit about ourselves because we're probably the newest player in this update. Dudek is an environmental and engineering consulting firm. Within Dudek, Allison, Matthew, and myself work on the fire protection and forestry planning team. I work as a fire protection planner and as a project manager. Matthew works as a fire behavior modeler and a fire risk and fire hazard analysis specialist. And Allison is our community outreach specialist. The people you see here, the three of us, are not the only people at Dudek who are working on this project. We're backed up by GIS specialists, by website developers, and by additional fire protection planners and community outreach people. And then I just wanted to briefly go over our experience as a fire planning team with wildfire protection planning documents and community wildfire protection plans. We have prepared more than 15 community wildfire protection plans or community wildfire protection plan updates for cities and counties across California. Next slide, please. And then I do want to go into a brief overview of the project. Next slide, please. So community wildfire protection is a collaborative plan. In this case, it's a collaboration between federal, state, local, and tribal agencies with the goal of reducing wildfire risk to people, the community, to infrastructure, and to natural resources. This particular community wildfire protection update is intended to build upon the successes of the 2019 Humboldt County Community Wildfire Protection Plan. You as a county has made significant progress in wildfire resiliency, and the goal is to build on that, those successes to help the county continue to enable more successes, to identify and fill gaps in the wildfire resiliency planning, to provide a more comprehensive wildfire spatial risk assessment, and to prepare and help with prioritization of project areas. Next slide, please. And then you are all more familiar with your area more than I am, but just briefly, the plan area includes the entirety of Humboldt County, and that area is 70% high or very high fire hazard severity, and it has a highly variable fire history in terms of fire frequency, fire severity, and fire return intervals. Next slide, please. And the final portion that I'd like to cover is the project timeline. Dudek has been working with the county since October 2025. During that time and up to this time of this meeting, we've been working with the county to collect background information about Humboldt County, and that includes reviewing the existing Community Wildfire Protection Plan, collecting information about the fire environment, about fire history, about progress that the county and county partners have made with implementing the Community Wildfire Protection Plan actions. And we've also been working on the fire hazard and fire risk analysis, which Matthew will cover during his presentation. We've been working on a draft prioritization framework for prioritizing project areas. And finally, we've also gone over the existing action plan items in the 2019 Community Wildfire Protection Plan. This portion of the project is absolutely vital. This is the community workshop where we can take all the information that we've reached so far, present it to the community, and get your feedback about wildfire concerns and about opportunities for improving wildfire resiliency in the county. After the meeting, we take what we've learned from the meeting and we work on preparing the draft and final Community Wildfire Protection Plan update with the intent of having a final version ready for publication. And that includes an update to the county's website, a story map for the hub site in December of 2026. Matthew, next slide, please. That is the end of my portion. I'm going to hand it off to Matthew to go over the spatial risk assessment.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's great to be with you all tonight. Thanks for spending your Tuesday evening with us. I know there's lots of places you could be, and we really appreciate you being here. As Jeremy mentioned, I have led the hazard and risk assessment and the larger spatial analysis for this project. It's been a great project. We've really enjoyed working on it, and so we're going to present some of our results today and provide a larger overview so you all can be familiar with the work to date. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the assessment, I did just want to go over some key factors in the county in regards to the wildfire environment that sort of set the stage for our analysis. So vegetation and terrain are obviously key components of fire hazard. They influence fire severity, fire spread, and even where fires are likely to occur. Humboldt County, as you know, is extremely diverse, given its marine as well as its inland environments. And this really results in a really great distribution of vegetation communities. Along coastal areas, we're seeing dominance of coastal redwood. Moving east, kind of transitioning to a mixed conifer forest. A lot of the county is forested. And within these forest types, we see lots of different forest structures as well. And this really influences the type of hazard you could expect in some forests. We also have oak woodlands and annual grasslands. This is a very different fire regime, but can also result in significant hazard. And so really what I want to emphasize here, and as you can see in this graphic, this aerial image, is that vegetation and as I'll touch on, terrain is extremely diverse. And this is why it was important to consider these during our spatial analysis as we begin to identify hazard, risk, and then project prioritization. Moving over to terrain, steep drainages characterize much of the county. This image is showing an example in the King Range, which is known for its steep terrain. Slopes exceeding 65% are quite common. So many drainages exist, obviously steep here. And this causes concern in a few different ways. Number one, fire behavior is often more severe on steep slopes as fire travels quickly uphill. In addition, this can cause issues for fire suppression as access can be limited. And then further, when we think about communities in these steeper areas, issues with evacuation, project implementation, and things like that can be influential in community risk. So in addition to vegetation and terrain, climate and weather are key and really important components of wildfire hazard throughout the county. Similar to vegetation, we see really strong variations in weather across the county. As you can see here on the right, the county is divided into multiple weather zones from the National Weather Service. And I'll touch on how we analyze this data and made sure that we're accounting for these variations in our assessment. Coastal regions, as you're all familiar, experience really high rates of fog, bringing higher fuel moisture and often lower wildfire hazard in the summer. However, during periods of when that fog is further off the coast, we can see wildfire hazard elevated in the county and even in coastal areas. This is from the CAL FIRE unit plan, which describes that wildfire hazard is elevated during approximately 55 days out of the year. So while Humboldt County may have a shorter fire season than other areas in the state and in Northern California, the potential for fire and severe fire still exists. In terms of winds, which we know really drive fire spread, the county experiences prevailing. So these are winds that occur most frequently, as well as extreme wind events. So prevailing winds typically flow from the northwest, from the coastal areas, and bring cooler, more moist air. However, as you move inland, fuel moistures and relative humidities often drop, so even prevailing wind conditions can result in fire spread. On the converse, we also see a rare but yet possible extreme eastern wind events. So these are somewhat similar to what you may think of when you think of Santa Ana in Southern California, however, specific to this northern geography. So these winds can be highly unpredictable and can occur during late summer typically. Another thing to consider when we think about weather is also the potential for lightning-caused ignitions. As I touch on historic wildfires in the county, especially those of late, we are seeing an increase in lightning-caused ignitions. And so all these components really play into the distribution of wildfire hazard and risks that we see across the county just due to the strong variations in weather. All right, speaking of wildfire history, I'm going to kind of break this up into two sections. Humboldt is a very long county north to south, so it's difficult to see on one screen. So that's why you'll see it kind of cut in half here. This is the northern portion of the county, and you can see fire history and fire perimeters by date. This data you're seeing is from CAL FIRE's FRAP fire history database. Red fires, as you can see in the legend, are those that have occurred more recently since 2016. And you can see that 2024 and 2023, even into 2022, that was quite an active year for fires, particularly on the eastern edge of the county. And this is something to note given the county is adjacent to large tracts of national forest, which often are the origin points for fires entering that eastern portion of the county. Some notable fires include the 2024 Boise fire, the 2022 red salmon, the 2024 mosquito, and then you can see a more coastal fire near Redwood National Park, the 2023 Lost Fire. Moving on the southern portion, we've seen less recent wildfires, however, still prevalent in the fire history record. Those lighter green fires you can see have occurred some decades ago. Notable fires in this area include 2015 Last Six Fire and the 2015 Blake Fire. One thing to note, as you see across both of these maps here, is these large areas of unburned vegetation. And so while many factors may play into where wildfires have historically occurred, it is important to note that just because fire hasn't occurred in an area does not mean that it will not. Oftentimes we see increased fuel loading and higher hazard vegetation in these areas that have not burned due to just that lack of natural disturbance. So something to consider as you're looking at these fire history maps. All right, so that's it for the wildfire environment. Now I'm going to talk about how all this data plays into our spatial assessment for the CWPP update. So first, I kind of just want to touch on what is the purpose. So other than the fact that identifying hazard and risk is required for CWPPs, the specific purpose for this project and this update was to build off the 2019 plan and provide a technically sound approach for planning wildfire mitigation projects throughout the county. As I've touched on multiple times, it's an extremely diverse county when it comes to vegetation, terrain, and weather, as well as community types. And so providing a technically sound framework is vital to ensure that projects are prioritized in a way that leads to the greatest reduction in community risk and wildfire hazard. You can see here on the right, the county is divided into these planning units. These are basically smaller areas. And these will come into play later as I talk about how we would actually implement the spatial assessment. So the spatial assessment has three main components, which I'll walk us through tonight. The first component is the hazard assessment. And so when we think about hazard, it's really important to remember that we're talking about wildland areas. So this is the potential and potential intensity and likelihood for wildfire in wildland areas. And hazard assessment for this project was conducted using wildfire behavior modeling, which essentially uses geospatial data and fire modeling softwares and other GIS analysis to determine how fire is going to behave on the landscape. So hazard assessment looks at natural vegetation. Risk assessment, on the other hand, is looking at the potential impacts to the built environment from that hazard. And so unlike hazard, we're moving away from these open areas into community areas and development areas to identify the potential impact to the built environment. And so both of these are related yet different. However, they both play into this third component, which is the spatial project prioritization tool. And so this component of the spatial assessment is taking all the data from the hazard assessment as well as the risk assessment. It's including other data sets that are influential for planning projects. And it's really trying to quantify, number one, the feasibility. So if you were to do a project, how likely could you implement it? What are the barriers to implementation? And number two, what's the potential benefit or hazard reduction? And this tool is going to help implementers and project planners identify hotspot locations for wildfire hazard and risk mitigation projects throughout the county. And so I touched on this, but here's just a little bit more information. So risk assessment, we're identifying human assets with high potential for damage. And these are guiding community-specific projects such as community edge field reduction treatments, targeted outreach, things of that nature. Whereas the hazard assessment is identifying, like I said, areas likely to experience high-intensity wildfire in the wildlands. And this is utilized to kind of plan landscape level restoration and forest health projects. And both of these, as I've mentioned, result and lead to the spatial project prioritization tool. Before I jump into the hazard assessment, I do just want to note the quick difference between our assessment and the CAL FIRE fire hazard severity zone maps. I'm sure many of us may be familiar with these maps, but if you're not, these are statewide maps classified into 3 categories for both the state and local responsibility areas. And they're really intended to guide code requirements as well as a general understanding of hazard in the county. And it's important to note that there's only 3 classes here, and these classes are statewide. So unlike this assessment, which is a statewide assessment and then provides rankings at the county level, our assessment was conducted at the county level in the first place and is really intended to provide a relative assessment based on county-specific conditions and a little bit more detail and resolution in the outputs. All right, so the hazard assessment began by acquiring landscape data. This is essentially the data that is going to determine how fire behaves on the landscape. We utilized Landfire's 2024 fuel model data set, but we had a unique opportunity to improve this data set based on some really high resolution LiDAR data produced by the North Coast Resource Partnership. And with this data, as you can see in the top image there, it really provides that granular look at forest and vegetation conditions. And so essentially this data was taken and used to supplement and improve the publicly available land fire data. And the second component, as I'll touch on here, is the weather analysis. So as I mentioned, weather variations are really common across the county, as you can see in this graphic here. So these are the different weather zones. And within these zones, you'll notice that there's these various weather stations. And our team utilized the data from these weather stations, which collects hourly data over the years, to identify wind speed, the direction of the wind, as well as the fuel moisture. And so that's the relative moisture in the vegetation. And the reason we needed to do this is to make sure that we weren't just applying one weather scenario across this diverse county. So for each of these weather zones, we modeled wildfire at the weather zone level using both 90th and 97th percentile values for each weather zone. So essentially this means the 10% and 3rd% worst weather conditions from a wildfire perspective. As I've mentioned, hazard is looking at fire behavior, and a key component of that in terms of severity is flame length. And so as you can see here on this graphic, it's difficult to kind of see the underlying hazard just based on the satellite imagery and the vegetation distributions you're seeing. But when you model the fire behavior, this is showing flame length. So red areas are expressing higher flame lengths than green and yellow areas. You're really able to identify the potential impacts to assets, the severity of the fire to begin with, as well as the suppression difficulty. So that was a key component that kind of covers the wildfire severity. And the second component of hazard is likelihood. And we modeled that through what is called burn probability modeling. Without going too into the weeds here, essentially we model thousands of simulated wildfires under different weather conditions to identify areas that have high overlap in fire occurrence. And so that's what you see here on the left. That's called short-term burn probability modeling. And that really identifies how terrain and the connectivity of vegetation is going to influence where wildfires are more likely to occur. But we know that there's annual trends in fire occurrences, particularly in Humboldt County. And so we also combined our short-term modeling with annual burn probability modeling. This was obtained from California's Wildfire Task Force data sets. And what's great about these is now you can combine that into a really kind of full encompassing identification of wildfire potential across the landscape. And so this is a combination of short-term, which is looking at vegetation and terrain, with an annual, which is looking at these seasonal trends that we've seen over the years. In all of our models, we're always, QA, QC in our work. And just kind of an interesting point here, you can see that there's small variations, yet oftentimes these variations are captured in the historical fire record. So if I go back one slide, you can see in the annual burn probability, that area wasn't captured here. However, when combined with our short-term modeling, you can see that it kind of stands out. Okay, so now into the results of the relative wildfire hazard mapping. Like I said, this is relative to the county level here. So red is areas of higher hazard, and then blue is areas of lower hazard. So you can see that how it's distributed across the county. Generally, as we move further east relative to the entire county, we're going to see a higher hazard due to lower fuel moistures and sometimes even greater wind speeds. So you can see that the area is really popping up in the northeastern portion of the county. But we also see scattered areas of hazard distributed throughout. Moving in the southern half, we can see the King Range is an area that pops up. While this area is coastal and receives quite a bit of marine influence, the terrain is very steep, and there's also been documented occurrences of some really strong eastern wind events, downslope wind events that can drive fire behavior. And I know we're covering this quickly, but all of these data sets will be made available during the CWP process, so you all can view these on an interactive map as part of the project's final deliverable. Once again, just kind of reviewing the hazard outputs with historic wildfires, it's generally a good indicator of if your models are somewhat correct, and we see really good alignment with historic wildfires. You can see that on the northern portion as well as the southern portion, where areas that have burned and have experienced fire in the past are showing up as higher hazard to this date. One thing to note as well about this hazard assessment, it's based on current fuel conditions. And so areas that have recently burned may show up as lower hazard. Over the years, as this analysis is repeated, potentially in future CWP updates, it would use then current data. So just keep that in mind. If areas have recently burned, they may show a lower hazard due to that loss of vegetation. And another quick note is that all these models have been collaborated with and kind of reviewed by CAL FIRE staff and other agency personnel to get good buy-in. So I just showed you wildfire hazard at the county level, but this CWP is really striving to help these individual planning units prioritize projects at the planning unit level. As I said, hazard across the county is often higher in more inland areas. And that's why maps like this are really important. So on the right, you can see if we just applied the countywide relative hazard ranking to the Humboldt Bay planning unit. But on the left, you can see what it looks like if we redistribute the data according to the relative range of values for the specific planning unit. And why this is important is that it really empowers these local areas to identify the relative hazard amongst their jurisdiction and areas where that they are potentially implementing projects. Okay, so that was wildfire hazard. We're going to go through wildfire risk now. So this is, once again, moving away from the open space, wildland areas, and looking at potential impacts to community assets. And our relative risk assessment for the county is a composite analysis. And what that means is it doesn't just look at one factor, yet includes a diverse set of input data sets that are used to determine community wildfire risk. So you can kind of see those here in the graphic on the right, as well as on the list on the left. So if your community is adjacent to a really high hazard area, that's obviously a really important indicator of your potential risk. So we're looking at adjacent wildfire hazard, extreme fire behavior. So that would be crown fire and rapid spread. We're also looking at ember impacts. So there's data sets that basically tell us what is the relative amount of embers that your community may experience during a wildfire. We're looking at the urban vegetation. So what's the vegetation like in and around homes? The terrain, is the community really steep? Can wildfire move quickly through the community itself? And related to that is housing density. Is there potential for maybe an urban conflagration if fire were to enter that community? And then finally, community access. Is there one way out? And these are all important factors that were considered. So once again, here are the results. You can see red, dark red is higher risk, and then the blue areas are showing as lower risk. You'll notice a strong trend in this data with the hazard data, given that that is an important input variable. But you also see some kind of nuance in the data given those other community attributes that I mentioned. Just give you all a moment to kind of look through that. And these data sets and these final maps will all be posted for public viewing as part of the project's deliverables. So this is a similar kind of figure to what I showed for hazard for the Humboldt Bay region specifically, just as an example. On the left, we're looking at the countywide risk ranking. So that's the relative risk values across the whole county from lowest to highest and then ranked accordingly. But on the right, we see that when you renormalize that to the planning unit, you're able to really see some more detailed depictions of community wild risk specific to that area. So these maps can be really influential for planning community projects specifically, targeted outreach, identifying areas that may be in need of representation, or Firewise community implementation, things of that nature, kind of really focus in on the communities themselves. All right, we're almost there. Last component. So all of this data will be combined into what we're calling the Spatial Project Prioritization Tool. While the hazard and the risk data sets can be used totally on their own for project implementation or project planning, when you combine those outputs with other relevant data sets, it really helps identify the and quantify the relative benefit and the feasibility of potential projects at the planning unit level. So there's that planning unit level you'll hear a lot, and really an emphasis point of this CWPP update. And so we're identifying hotspot locations for prioritized mitigation. So you can imagine these hotspot locations would have one high hazard, high risk, as well as high potential to implement a project. So the slopes aren't too steep, there's road access, things like that. And so we're looking at how project is going to mitigate the hazard, but also identify potential implementation challenges, given the fact that we know implementation is really what makes or break a project. Our analysis and final deliverable for this will look different than the example here on the right, but just kind of wanted to give you an overview of what this will potentially look like. This is an example that our firm conducted for Nevada County CWPP, and you can see how the wildfire benefit and feasibility scores are represented. And as you drop projects and plan projects, you get specific data showing you where your project excels and where your project maybe is lacking. All right, that was a lot. Thanks all for